The first-class lounge at the bustling airport was an oasis of calm amid the chaos of travelers rushing to their gates. Marcus, a tall, poised black man in a tailored suit, sat at a corner table. His laptop screen glowed with the intricate charts of a business presentation. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. A glass of sparkling water rested untouched beside him, condensation pooling beneath it. He was used to these lounges, used to the quiet efficiency of the staff, and used to the occasional glances that questioned whether he belonged there. Anna, a flight attendant with years of experience, moved through the lounge with practiced ease. She was polite and professional, her uniform crisp and her hair perfectly styled. But when her eyes landed on Marcus, there was a flicker of hesitation, a quick assessment that lingered just a second too long. It wasn't overt, but it was there. An unspoken question in her gaze, something that Marcus, over the years, had become adept at reading. As Marcus closed his laptop and prepared to board, he felt a pang of exhaustion, not from the flight ahead but from what he sensed was coming. He had experienced it before. The awkward moments, the subtle slights, the assumptions. But he pushed the thought aside. He had a business deal to close, and nothing else mattered. At the gate, the pre-boarding announcement for first-class passengers echoed through the air. Marcus approached the counter, his boarding pass ready. Anna stood nearby, helping guide passengers. When Marcus handed over his ticket, she glanced at it, her expression remaining professional but slightly cool. "Enjoy your flight," she said, her tone polite but lacking warmth. "Thank you," Marcus replied, his voice calm but firm, his confidence unshaken. He walked toward the jet bridge, feeling her eyes on his back. Inside the plane, Marcus settled into his seat near the front of the first-class cabin. The leather seat was comfortable, the kind of luxury he had worked hard to afford. Passengers began filing in, some with curious glances that lingered on him before moving on. Marcus paid them no mind, scrolling through his phone and reviewing notes for his presentation. Anna entered the cabin, a practiced smile on her face as she greeted each passenger. When she reached Marcus, there was that brief hesitation again, the flicker of discomfort that he caught out of the corner of his eye. She handed him a menu for the pre-flight service, her voice measured. "Would you like something to drink before we take off?" she asked. "Champagne, please," Marcus replied, his tone courteous but distant. He didn't look up, keeping his focus on his phone. She nodded and moved away. A few moments later, she returned with a glass of champagne, placing it on the tray table in front of him. There was a pause, a fleeting moment where her professional mask slipped, and her voice carried a hint of something sharper. "Careful with that. Don't want to overdo it." Marcus looked up, surprised. Their eyes met for the first time. He saw the tension in her expression, the unspoken assumptions behind her words. For a moment, he considered saying something, but instead, he offered a neutral smile. "Thank you," he said simply, taking the glass. Anna walked away, and Marcus turned back to his phone, but the moment lingered in the air. He could feel it, the unease, the weight of judgments from people who barely knew him. Around him, the other first-class passengers settled into their seats, their small conversations and rustling belongings filling the space with a muted hum. He could feel their occasional glances too, the curiosity, the quiet scrutiny. As the plane began to taxi, Marcus leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes briefly. The champagne sat untouched. He reminded himself that he had been through worse, that he had overcome far greater challenges than this. But as the engines roared to life and the plane lifted into the sky, he couldn't shake the feeling that this flight was going to be different. As the plane leveled out at cruising altitude, Marcus tried to immerse himself in his work. His laptop illuminated his focused face as he typed away, occasionally adjusting his glasses. The cabin was quiet, save for the soft hum of the engines and the occasional clink of glasses or hushed murmurs from fellow passengers. Anna moved gracefully between rows, offering drinks and snacks to passengers. She served everyone with the same professional smile, but when she approached Marcus's seat again, there was a noticeable shift in her demeanor. She paused, tray in hand, as if deliberating something. "Would you like another drink, sir?" she asked, her voice carefully measured. Marcus glanced up, noting the slight edge in her tone. He took a breath, reminding himself to stay composed. "Yes, another champagne, please." Anna nodded curtly and turned away. As she walked back to the galley, her smile dropped. She muttered something under her breath to a fellow flight attendant, a younger woman named Claire. "He's already had one," Anna said, her voice low but laced with disapproval. "I don't want to deal with the situation later." Claire raised an eyebrow. "He seems fine to me. Just doing his work." Anna sighed, brushing off the comment as she poured the champagne. She returned to Marcus's seat, placing the glass on his tray table. "Let me know if you need anything else," she said, her voice clipped. Marcus thanked her politely and returned to his laptop, choosing to ignore her tone. 2 rows behind Marcus, a middle-aged man in a suit leaned toward his companion. "You see that? He's already on his second drink," he whispered, loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. His companion chuckled, shaking his head. Marcus overheard, but pretended not to. His jaw tightened slightly, his fingers pausing on the keyboard. He took a sip of the champagne, more to steady his nerves than out of desire. Meanwhile, Anna remained in the galley, her mind racing. She was certain she'd seen this kind of situation before. A passenger who seemed fine at first but turned into a problem later. She convinced herself that she was just being cautious, that she wasn't biased, that it wasn't about him. But deep down, there was a discomfort she couldn't quite articulate. Something that had been simmering since she saw him in the lounge. Not long after, Marcus called for a refill. Anna hesitated but brought him another glass, her professional mask starting to crack. This time, she didn't bother to hide the hint of irritation in her voice as she set the drink down. "Are you sure you're okay with another one?" she asked, her tone pointed. Marcus looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Excuse me?" "I just mean," she gestured vaguely. "It's a long flight. You might want to pace yourself." A quiet tension filled the space between them. Nearby passengers began to glance over, sensing the unease. Marcus leaned back in his seat, carefully choosing his words. "I'm perfectly fine, thank you," he said, his voice calm but firm. Anna gave a tight smile and walked away, her cheeks flushing with a mix of frustration and embarrassment. She could feel the weight of the passengers' gazes as she returned to the galley. "Everything okay out there?" Claire asked, noticing Anna's flustered expression. I don't know. Something about him," Anna said, avoiding eye contact. "I think he's going to be trouble." Claire frowned. "He hasn't done anything wrong. You might be reading too much into it." Anna didn't respond, but her mind was already spinning. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Back in his seat, Marcus tried to shake off the interaction. He resumed working, but his focus wavered. The champagne, still mostly untouched, sat forgotten on his tray. He glanced around the cabin, noticing the subtle glances from other passengers, the whispers, the assumptions. He had dealt with this kind of treatment before, but it never got easier. Each instance chipped away at the armor he had built over the years. As the flight continued, the atmosphere in the cabin grew heavier. Anna kept watching Marcus from a distance, her unease growing with every passing moment. And Marcus, sensing the mounting tension, prepared himself for what he feared might come next. As the plane cruised smoothly above the clouds, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin became increasingly charged. Marcus had closed his laptop, unable to concentrate any longer. He leaned back in his seat, gazing out the window at the endless sky, trying to center himself. The faint murmur of passengers' conversations and the occasional clink of glassware filled the cabin. Still, he felt the weight of invisible eyes on him. Anna remained in the galley, her unease growing with every passing moment. She glanced down at the passenger manifest, her finger resting on Marcus's name. There was nothing remarkable about it, nothing to warrant the discomfort she felt, but in her mind, she had already pieced together a narrative. A man drinking champagne, becoming louder, potentially disruptive. She believed she was being vigilant, but deep down, part of her knew there was more to her assumptions than she wanted to admit. The tipping point came when Marcus pressed the call button. Anna took a steadying breath before walking over to his seat. Her smile, once polite, was now stiff and forced. "How can I help you?" she asked. Marcus gestured toward his empty glass. "May I have some water, please?" Anna hesitated, her gaze flicking to the champagne glass beside him. "Are you sure you don't want to wait a bit? Maybe some coffee instead?" Marcus's brows furrowed. "Water is fine, thank you." Her hesitation was subtle but palpable. After a moment, she nodded and left to fetch the water. As she walked away, a white man across the aisle leaned toward his seatmate, whispering just loudly enough for Marcus to hear. "Unbelievable. Some people just don't know when to stop." Marcus exhaled slowly, gripping the armrests of his seat. He turned to face the man, his voice calm but pointed. "Is there something you'd like to say to me directly?" The man raised his hands in mock surrender. "Just making an observation, that's all." The exchange caught the attention of other passengers, who turned to watch, their curiosity mingled with discomfort. Anna returned with the water, just in time to see Marcus and the man locking eyes. She froze for a moment before stepping between them. "Sir," she said to Marcus, her voice low and firm, "is everything all right?" Marcus looked at her, his frustration barely contained. "I'm fine. Thank you." Anna hesitated, glancing at the man across the aisle, who gave her a knowing look, as if to say, "See, maybe it would be a good idea to take a break from beverages for now," Anna suggested. Her tone was gentle but patronizing, and it hit Marcus like a slap. He set his glass down on the tray table, folding his hands in his lap. "I've had 2 glasses of champagne. I'm sitting here quietly, minding my business. What exactly is the issue?" Anna's professional facade faltered. "There's no issue, sir. I'm just looking out for everyone's comfort and safety." "Are you?" Marcus replied, his voice steady but cold. "Or are you making assumptions based on something else entirely?" The tension in the cabin became almost tangible. Passengers exchanged glances, some murmuring quietly. A woman a few rows back muttered, "Why is he making such a big deal out of nothing?" A young man sitting near the window took out his phone, discreetly recording the interaction. Anna straightened, her cheeks flushed. "There's no need to make this personal, sir. I'm just doing my job." "Then do it," Marcus said, his voice sharp but controlled. "Because right now, it feels like you're targeting me for no reason." The confrontation drew the attention of the captain, who emerged from the cockpit to assess the situation. He approached Anna and asked what was happening. "It's nothing," Anna said quickly, her voice a little too high-pitched. "Just a passenger who might be overindulging." Marcus stood up, his movements deliberate and composed. "Captain, I've had 2 drinks. I'm perfectly sober, and I'd like to know why I'm being singled out." The captain glanced between Marcus and Anna, clearly uncomfortable. "Let's all take a breath," he said, his tone placating. "There's no need for any conflict." "There wasn't any until your flight attendant decided to make one," Marcus replied. The captain sighed and gestured for Anna to step aside. He spoke to her in hushed tones, but Marcus caught snippets of the conversation. "Protocol. No real disruption. Be cautious." Anna returned to the galley, her face set in a hard line. The captain apologized to Marcus, but it was perfunctory, the kind of apology meant to smooth things over without addressing the root of the issue. As Marcus sat back down, the young man with the phone discreetly uploaded the video he'd taken to social media. Within minutes, comments began pouring in, half condemning Anna's behavior, half defending her. The flight continued, but the atmosphere in the cabin was irrevocably altered. Marcus could feel the weight of judgment from both sides, the passengers who believed him and those who didn't. Anna avoided his row for the rest of the flight, her discomfort mounting as whispers spread among the crew about what had happened. By the time the plane began its descent, the story was already spreading online, the beginnings of a storm brewing far beyond the confines of the aircraft. Marcus stared out the window, his jaw tight, knowing this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the plane descended toward its destination, the atmosphere in the cabin was thick with tension. The whispers from first-class passengers had spread to the economy section, where speculation about the incident in first class had taken on a life of its own. Marcus remained in his seat, composed but visibly strained, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. He had become the unwitting center of a drama he never asked for, and he could feel the accusatory weight of it pressing on him. In the galley, Anna stood with Claire, her voice low and agitated. "I don't care what anyone says," Anna muttered. "He's been confrontational since the start. I'm not going to sit back and wait for things to escalate." Claire gave her a measured look. "He hasn't done anything wrong, Anna. Honestly, I think you're overreacting." Anna bristled. "Overreacting? Claire, we've seen this before. It always starts small, and then suddenly it's chaos at 35,000 feet. It always starts small?" Claire repeated, her tone incredulous. "Listen to yourself. You're making this about something it isn't." Anna turned away, crossing her arms. She didn't want to admit that Claire's words stung because a part of her knew they were true. But the discomfort, the instinctive distrust she felt toward Marcus, was deeply ingrained, and she wasn't ready to confront it. Meanwhile, Marcus remained seated, his frustration bubbling just below the surface. He could hear passengers behind him whispering, their words just audible enough to reach him. He was drinking the whole flight, one man said. What did he expect? Exactly, another chimed in. You don't act like that in first class. Marcus turned slightly, catching the eyes of one of the speakers. The man quickly looked away, his cheeks reddening. But Marcus could see the smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their approach and the expected landing time. The announcement barely registered with Marcus, who was grappling with the growing storm of emotions inside him. Anger, humiliation, and a gnawing sense of déjà vu churned within him. He had worked tirelessly to reach the level of success he now enjoyed. Yet here he was, being reduced to a stereotype by people who didn't know him. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, Marcus prepared himself for what was to come. He could feel the energy in the cabin shift, passengers gathering their belongings, the subtle hum of whispered conversations growing louder. Anna was stationed near the front of the cabin, her posture rigid, her face set in a mask of professionalism. When the seatbelt sign was turned off, Marcus stood, reaching for his carry-on. The young man who had been recording the earlier interaction locked eyes with him and gave a slight nod, as if to say, "I've got your back." Marcus acknowledged him with a faint, grateful smile. But the respite was short-lived. As Marcus moved to leave the plane, Anna stepped forward, blocking his path. Her voice was calm, but there was a firmness to it that carried an undercurrent of authority. "Mr. Carter, could you please remain seated for a moment? The captain would like to speak with you." The cabin went quiet. All eyes turned toward Marcus, who stood frozen for a moment before slowly lowering his back. He met Anna's gaze, his own eyes blazing with disbelief and anger. "Is this really necessary?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Anna didn't waver. "It's standard procedure when there's been a disturbance during the flight." "Disturbance?" Marcus repeated. His voice rose slightly, drawing murmurs from the passengers around him. "The only disturbance here is you targeting me for no reason." Anna's cheeks flushed, but she didn't back down. "Please, sir. It's for everyone's safety." Claire, who had been watching the exchange from a few feet away, stepped forward. "Anna, maybe this isn't." "It's fine," Marcus interrupted, raising a hand to stop her. "I'll wait." The captain emerged from the cockpit, his expression carefully neutral. He glanced at Anna, then at Marcus. "Mr. Carter," the captain began, "we just wanted to make sure everything was resolved before you disembark. We take the comfort and safety of all our passengers seriously." Marcus's patience finally snapped. "Comfort and safety? Is that what you call this? Being accused, humiliated, and treated like a threat because of someone's unfounded assumptions?" The captain held up his hands in a placating gesture. "There's no need to escalate things further." "I'm not escalating anything," Marcus said, his voice firm but controlled. "I've been calm this entire time, but your flight attendant has been targeting me from the moment I stepped on this plane." Passengers began murmuring more loudly, some nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads. The young man with the phone stepped forward. "I have it all on video," he said, his voice steady. "He didn't do anything wrong." The declaration sent a ripple through the cabin. Anna's face drained of color, her confident stance faltering for the first time. She looked at Marcus, then at the passengers around her, and finally back at the captain. The captain sighed heavily, realizing the situation was spiraling out of control. "Let's take this conversation off the plane," he said. "Mr. Carter, we'll have someone from the airline speak with you in the terminal." Marcus grabbed his bag and stepped into the aisle, his shoulders squared. As he walked past Anna, he paused, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "You should think about why you felt the need to do this. It says more about you than it does about me." Anna didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the floor. Marcus continued down the aisle, the young man with the phone following close behind. As they stepped into the terminal, the tension of the flight followed them, lingering like a shadow. Outside the gate, a small group of airport security officers waited, along with a representative from the airline. Marcus knew the ordeal wasn't over, but he also knew he wasn't going to stay silent. As Marcus stepped into the terminal, the sterile fluorescent lights and muted colors of the airport did nothing to soften the storm brewing around him. A small crowd had gathered near the gate, airport security officers in crisp uniforms, airline representatives clutching clipboards, and a few curious onlookers who had heard snippets of the commotion on the plane. The young man who had recorded the incident trailed behind Marcus, holding his phone firmly in his hand, ready to capture what might come next. One of the airline representatives, a middle-aged woman with a name tag that read Janet, approached Marcus with a tight smile that failed to reach her eyes. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice strained but attempting to remain professional. "I'm Janet, the passenger liaison for the airline. We'd like to discuss the incident on board." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Incident?" he repeated, his voice calm but laced with disbelief. "Is that what we're calling it now?" Janet glanced nervously at the security officers, who stood a few feet away, their presence making the situation feel more ominous than it already was. "If we could just step over here," she said, gesturing toward a small conference room nearby. "We'd like to hear your side of the story." Marcus hesitated, his eyes scanning the room. He noticed the passengers from the flight trickling out of the gate, their faces alight with curiosity and judgment. Some paused to watch, their phones held discreetly, or not so discreetly, at their sides. Others whispered among themselves, their words indistinct but their tones unmistakable. The young man with the phone stepped forward. "I've got his side of the story," he said firmly. "It's all on video." Janet's eyes widened slightly, and she exchanged a quick look with one of the security officers. "That's fine," she said, her voice a little sharper now. "But we still need to address this properly. Mr. Carter, please?" Marcus sighed, adjusting his bag on his shoulder. He gave a slight nod to the young man. "Thank you," he said quietly, "but I can handle this." He followed Janet into the small conference room, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Inside, another airline official sat waiting, a man in his late 50s with thinning hair and a stern expression. He introduced himself as Richard, the airline's regional operations manager. "We appreciate your cooperation, Mr. Carter," Richard began, folding his hands on the table in front of him. "We've been informed there was a disagreement between you and one of our flight attendants. We'd like to understand what happened." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "A disagreement?" he echoed. "That's an interesting way to frame being publicly humiliated and accused of being drunk for no reason." Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. "Our staff are trained to prioritize passenger safety. If the flight attendant felt concerned—" "She wasn't concerned," Marcus interrupted, his voice firm but controlled. "She was biased, and everyone on that plane could see it." Janet shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hands gripping her clipboard. "Mr. Carter, we understand this is a sensitive matter, but—" "No," Marcus said, leaning forward now, his eyes locking onto Richard's. "You don't understand, because if you did, you wouldn't be sitting here trying to justify what happened. That flight attendant singled me out the moment I stepped onto the plane. She saw me, made assumptions, and acted on them. And instead of addressing her behavior, you're here trying to spin this as a misunderstanding." Richard's expression hardened. "Mr. Carter, we're simply trying to gather the facts." "The facts are simple," Marcus said, his voice rising slightly. "I was targeted because of the color of my skin, and now you're trying to sweep it under the rug?" There was a tense silence in the room. Janet shifted in her seat, avoiding Marcus's gaze. Richard sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Mr. Carter," he said finally, "we'll conduct a thorough investigation into this matter. But for now, we ask for your patience while we handle it internally." Marcus laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Patience? I've been patient my whole life. And where has it gotten me? Humiliated in front of a plane full of people, treated like a criminal for daring to exist in first class." He stood, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You want to investigate? Go ahead. But don't think for a second I'm going to let this go quietly." With that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Janet and Richard staring after him. The door closed behind him, and the noise of the terminal washed over him like a wave. Outside the conference room, the young man with the phone was waiting. "How'd it go?" he asked. Marcus gave a small, humorless smile. "About as well as expected." The young man nodded. "The video's already blowing up online. People are on your side." Marcus's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Already?" "Yeah," the young man said, holding up his phone. "I posted it as soon as we landed. It's everywhere now. People are calling it out for what it is, racism." Marcus exhaled, a mix of relief and exhaustion washing over him. He didn't relish the idea of becoming the face of a viral controversy, but he knew this was bigger than him. If his experience could shine a light on the systemic issues so many people faced, then he wasn't going to shy away from it. As he walked toward the baggage claim, the weight of the day began to settle on him. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been made to feel like less than they were, simply because of the color of their skin. And he wasn't going to stop until something changed. As Marcus exited the terminal, the airport lobby was abuzz. People gathered in clusters, some glued to their phones, others exchanging excited whispers. The viral video from the plane had already ignited a firestorm online, and Marcus could feel its weight as he moved toward the baggage claim. A few people recognized him, their glances lingering as they debated whether to approach. Most didn't, but their stares told him everything he needed to know. The story was out there, and so was his name. Outside, his driver was waiting with the car door open, but before Marcus could step inside, a journalist with a handheld microphone rushed toward him. "Mr. Carter," she called, her voice cutting through the low hum of the crowd. "Do you have any comments about the allegations of discrimination on your flight?" Marcus paused, his instinct to ignore her warring with the knowledge that this moment was bigger than himself. He turned to face her, standing tall despite the exhaustion visible in his eyes. "I'll say this," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "What happened to me on that flight isn't new. It's a symptom of a much larger problem. Systemic racism that's embedded in how people see each other, how they treat each other, and how institutions like airlines enable it. This isn't just about me. It's about something we all need to address." The journalist nodded, her eyes lighting up at the soundbite. "Do you plan to take action against the airline?" Marcus hesitated. He hadn't planned his next move yet, but the resolve in his voice was unshakable. "I'm considering every option," he said. "But what's more important is holding them accountable, not just for me, but for anyone who's been treated unfairly." With that, he stepped into the car, closing the door firmly behind him. The driver nodded respectfully and pulled away from the curb. As the city blurred past the tinted windows, Marcus leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. The journalist's question echoed in his thoughts. What next? Meanwhile, back at the airline's corporate headquarters, a crisis meeting was already underway. A dozen executives sat around a long conference table, their faces illuminated by the glow of a large screen displaying the viral video. The clip, now with millions of views, showed Marcus sitting calmly in his seat as Anna stood over him, her voice raised and accusatory. The young man recording the scene narrated in the background, his tone incredulous. "This is blatant discrimination," he had said. "That man's done nothing wrong, but look how she's treating him." The video ended with Marcus's pointed words to Anna. "You should think about why you felt the need to do this. It says more about you than it does about me." One executive, a man in his late 40s with a perpetual frown, cleared his throat. "This is a PR nightmare," he said. "We need to control the narrative immediately." "Control the narrative?" Another executive shot back, a younger woman with a sharp gaze. "We need to address the root issue. This is a clear case of racial bias, and it's going to keep happening if we don't do something." The room erupted into a heated debate. Some argued for a carefully worded statement to appease the public, while others insisted on a full investigation and a public apology to Marcus. At the head of the table, the CEO, a composed woman with silver hair and a steely demeanor, raised her hand, silencing the room. "We need to approach this strategically," she said. "First, we release a statement expressing our commitment to fairness and equality. Then we initiate an internal review of the incident and temporarily suspend the flight attendant involved. But make no mistake, this isn't going away until we show real accountability." Back at his hotel, Marcus sat at a desk, staring at his laptop. His inbox was flooded with emails, messages of support from strangers, offers from lawyers eager to represent him, and inquiries from reporters seeking exclusive interviews. His phone buzzed incessantly with notifications from social media, where hashtags like #FlyingWhileBlack and #JusticeForMarcus were trending. Scrolling through the comments on the video, Marcus saw an outpouring of solidarity mixed with the inevitable backlash. Some accused him of overreacting, while others doubled down on defending Anna, painting her as a professional just doing her job. The vitriol stung, but the support bolstered him. A notification popped up from an advocacy group for racial equality in corporate spaces. They invited him to speak at an upcoming event, emphasizing the importance of using his platform to shed light on the broader issue. Marcus leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He hadn't asked for this spotlight, but now that it was on him, he felt a responsibility to use it wisely. The airline's official statement was released later that evening. It read, "At Skywings Airlines, we are committed to ensuring the safety and dignity of all our passengers. We take allegations of discrimination seriously and are conducting a thorough investigation into the incident involving Mr. Carter. While we cannot comment on individual personnel matters, we have placed the flight attendant on temporary leave pending the outcome of our review. We apologize to Mr. Carter and all passengers who may have been affected. We are committed to learning and improving from this incident." The statement was met with mixed reactions. Supporters of Marcus criticized it as a vague attempt at damage control, while others applauded the airline for taking initial steps toward accountability. Marcus read the statement on his phone, his lips curling into a bitter smile. "Temporary leave," he muttered to himself. "That's their idea of accountability?" His phone buzzed with a call. It was his publicist, Lisa, who had been fielding media inquiries on his behalf. "They want you on every morning show tomorrow," Lisa said. "Good Morning America, CNN, even some late-night hosts are interested. What do you want to do?" Marcus sighed. "I'll do one interview," he said, "but it's not going to be about me. It's about the bigger picture." Lisa paused. "You sure? This is your moment, Marcus." "No," Marcus said firmly. "It's everyone's moment. Let's make it count." As the night deepened, Marcus stared out the hotel window at the city lights below. The weight of what had happened pressed down on him, but so did a sense of purpose. He had been thrust into this fight, but now that he was in it, he was determined to see it through. Tomorrow, the world would hear his story, not just as a victim, but as a voice for change. The next morning, Marcus awoke to the soft chime of his alarm. The hotel room was quiet, but outside, the city hummed with activity. Today wasn't just another day. It was the day he would step into the public eye and confront the narrative surrounding what had happened to him. He had agreed to appear on Good Morning America, and the car to take him to the studio was waiting downstairs. Marcus dressed in a sharp navy suit, the kind he wore for major business meetings. This wasn't just about looking good, it was armor. As he adjusted his tie, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from his assistant. "Marcus, the interview clip from the flight attendants union just dropped. You need to see this." Curious, Marcus opened the link. It led to a video statement from the flight attendants union spokesperson, a woman with a kind but weary face. She spoke directly to the camera. While we support all our members, we do not condone discriminatory behavior of any kind. That said, flight attendants are often put in challenging situations where snap judgments must be made. In the case of Mr. Carter, we believe our member acted out of caution, not malice. Marcus's jaw tightened. Caution, not malice, he thought bitterly. The excuse was paper-thin. His resolve to address this head-on solidified. At the Good Morning America studio, Marcus was greeted by the show's producers and ushered into a brightly lit room with cameras and an inviting blue and white set. The host, a seasoned journalist with a warm demeanor, shook his hand and gestured for him to sit. Marcus Carter, thank you for joining us, she began once the cameras started rolling. Your story has captured national attention, sparking conversations about racial bias in the airline industry and beyond. Can you walk us through what happened? Marcus took a breath, his voice steady but filled with conviction. What happened to me on that flight was more than just an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern that many people of color experience daily, being judged, scrutinized, and targeted for no other reason than the way we look. The host nodded, her expression thoughtful. The airline has issued a statement and placed the flight attendant on temporary leave. Do you feel that's enough? Marcus's gaze was unwavering. No, it's not enough. A temporary leave doesn't address the systemic issues that allowed this to happen in the first place. This isn't just about one flight attendant, it's about the culture of bias that exists in many institutions, including the airline industry. The interview continued, with Marcus sharing his perspective on how these incidents erode trust and dignity. He spoke about his success as a businessman and how, even with all he'd achieved, he still couldn't escape the weight of prejudice. Meanwhile, back at Skywings Airlines, Anna sat in a small conference room, her hands clenched around a cup of coffee. She had been summoned to meet with the airline's HR team and legal counsel. The temporary leave had been a blow, but now she faced something far worse, a potential investigation into her behavior. The HR representative, a middle-aged man with a neutral expression, started the meeting. Anna, we've reviewed the footage from the flight, as well as the statements from passengers and crew. We want to hear your side of the story. Anna hesitated, her mind racing. She felt defensive, cornered. I was just following protocol, she said, her voice tight. He was drinking, and I thought he might become disruptive. I was trying to ensure the safety of everyone on board. The HR representative leaned forward. Multiple passengers, including crew members, stated that Mr. Carter was calm and cooperative throughout the flight. Do you think it's possible you misjudged the situation? I don't know, Anna said, her voice faltering. Maybe I did. But it wasn't about race. It wasn't. Her words sounded hollow, even to herself. Deep down, Anna felt the cracks in her own justification widening. She thought back to the moment she first saw Marcus in the lounge, to the assumptions she'd made without realizing it. A heavy weight settled on her chest. That afternoon, Marcus received an unexpected email. It was from Anna herself. The subject line read, "An apology and a request for understanding." Curious, he opened it. The message was carefully worded, but there was an undercurrent of genuine remorse. Mr. Carter, I want to sincerely apologize for my behavior on the flight. Looking back, I see that I made assumptions that were unfair and hurtful. I allowed biases I wasn't even fully aware of to affect how I treated you. I deeply regret the pain and humiliation I caused. I understand if you don't want to hear from me, but I felt it was important to acknowledge my actions and take accountability. I hope this can be the beginning of my own journey to do better. Marcus stared at the email for a long moment. It was an unexpected olive branch, but it didn't erase what had happened. Still, he knew that real change required more than punishment. It required education and transformation. He decided to reply, crafting a response that was firm but constructive. Anna, thank you for reaching out. I appreciate your willingness to acknowledge your actions and their impact. What happened on that flight wasn't just about me. It's part of a larger issue that affects so many others. I hope you use this moment to reflect and grow, not just for yourself, but to help change the culture within the airline industry. Accountability is important, but so is education. Let's both work toward creating a world where this doesn't happen again. Marcus, as the day drew to a close, Marcus felt a mix of emotions: exhaustion, vindication, and a cautious sense of hope. The fight wasn't over, but the conversation had begun, and for the first time, it felt like the world might actually be listening. The public reaction to Marcus's interview on Good Morning America was immediate and overwhelming. Social media erupted with hashtags like #AccountabilityNow and #FlyingWhileBlack, while news outlets picked up on the deeper implications of the story. Prominent figures, including celebrities, activists, and political leaders, weighed in, calling for systemic changes in the airline industry. Marcus's words had struck a chord, and the conversation was no longer just about his flight. It was about the broader realities of racial bias in public spaces. But with the wave of support came an equally loud wave of backlash. Online forums buzzed with debates. Some accused Marcus of playing the race card, while others painted Anna as a scapegoat in a tense and challenging job. The polarization was sharp, and Marcus found himself at the center of a cultural flashpoint. At Skywings Airlines, the pressure was mounting. The airline's initial statement had done little to quell the outrage, and shareholders were now demanding action. In an emergency meeting, the CEO outlined a new plan. "We need to show we're serious about change," she said, addressing the room of executives. "This isn't just about damage control, it's about proving that we're learning from this." She announced a series of initiatives: a comprehensive review of training programs, mandatory bias awareness workshops for all employees, and the creation of a diversity and inclusion council to address systemic issues within the company. Meanwhile, Anna was grappling with the fallout from her actions. Her temporary leave had become indefinite, and she found herself inundated with messages, some supportive, others scathing. The apology email she had sent to Marcus was a step towards self-reflection, but it wasn't enough to ease the guilt gnawing at her. Desperate for clarity, she decided to attend a local workshop on unconscious bias. Sitting in a circle with others who had come to confront their prejudices, Anna listened as the facilitator spoke about the subtle ways biases manifest and the harm they cause. "You don't have to be overtly hateful to contribute to racism," the facilitator said. "Sometimes it's in the assumptions you make, the judgments you pass without even realizing it." Anna felt tears prick her eyes as she thought back to the flight. She had prided herself on being fair and professional, but now she couldn't deny the truth. She had let her biases control her actions. After the workshop, Anna stayed behind to speak with the facilitator. "What do I do now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How do I make this right?" "Start by educating yourself," the facilitator said, "and then use what you've learned to educate others. Change begins with accountability." For Marcus, the days following the interview were a whirlwind. He had been approached by multiple organizations and advocacy groups, all wanting him to lend his voice to their causes. While he appreciated the support, he was careful to focus on initiatives that aligned with his values. He partnered with a prominent civil rights organization to launch a campaign advocating for better training and accountability in the airline industry. As part of the campaign, Marcus agreed to participate in a roundtable discussion with airline executives, including Skywings CEO. The event, broadcast live, was a tense but productive conversation. Marcus spoke candidly about his experience and pushed for concrete commitments. "This isn't about punishing one person," Marcus said during the discussion. "It's about changing the systems and cultures that allow this kind of behavior to thrive." The CEO, to her credit, acknowledged the airline's shortcomings and pledged to implement the changes she had announced. "We know we have a long way to go," she said, "but we're committed to getting there." One evening, Marcus received an unexpected call. It was Anna. Her voice was shaky, but there was a determination in her tone. "Mr. Carter," she began, "I wanted to thank you for responding to my email. And I wanted to apologize again. I've been doing a lot of reflecting, and I see now how deeply wrong I was. I know I can't undo what I did, but I want to make amends. If there's anything I can do to help with your efforts, I'm willing." Marcus was silent for a moment, surprised by her sincerity. "Anna," he said finally, "I appreciate that. If you're serious about making amends, then use your experience to educate others. Be part of the change." They spoke for a while longer, and by the end of the conversation, Marcus felt a small but significant shift. Anna's willingness to confront her actions and learn from them was a step toward healing, not just for her, but for the larger issue they were both now entwined in. Weeks turned into months, and the incident aboard the Skywing's flight continued to ripple through public consciousness. Marcus found himself becoming a reluctant but effective advocate for change. This partnership with the civil rights organization grew into a nationwide campaign called Equity in the Skies, aimed at combating systemic biases in the airline industry. The campaign brought together activists, passengers, and even airline employees who shared their stories of discrimination and pledged to work toward solutions. Anna's journey. For Anna, the weeks following her apology to Marcus were transformative. She immersed herself in educational resources about unconscious bias, attending workshops, reading extensively, and joining discussions that forced her to confront her own complicity in perpetuating harmful stereotypes. At first, the journey was painful. She felt defensive, embarrassed, and overwhelmed by the weight of her actions. But as she pushed through the discomfort, she began to see the world, and herself, more clearly. One day, Anna reached out to Skywing's new Diversity and Inclusion Council. "I want to help," she said, "not just to fix what I've done, but to prevent it from happening again." The council welcomed her input, and she began collaborating on a new training program for flight attendants. The program included scenarios based on real incidents, including hers, and focused on teaching employees to recognize and challenge their biases. Marcus's advocacy. Marcus, meanwhile, took his advocacy work to new heights. He testified before Congress during hearings on racial equity in transportation, sharing his experience and calling for industry-wide reforms. His testimony was compelling, filled with personal anecdotes and data, highlighting the prevalence of discrimination in air travel. "This isn't just about one bad flight or one biased flight attendant," Marcus said to the committee. "It's about an entire system that treats people differently based on the color of their skin, their gender, or their background. We need policies that protect everyone's dignity." His words sparked a wave of bipartisan support for new legislation that required airlines to implement bias training for all employees and to establish independent oversight committees to handle discrimination complaints. Skywing's transformation. Under mounting pressure from the public and its stakeholders, Skywings took bold steps to repair its reputation. The airline announced sweeping reforms, including mandatory annual bias training for all employees, a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination, and the creation of a passenger advocacy hotline. The airline's CEO invited Marcus to participate in a public town hall meeting to discuss the changes. At first, Marcus hesitated. He had no desire to be used as a symbol for their PR efforts. But after consulting with his team and the civil rights organization, he agreed, with conditions. "I'm not here to absolve you," Marcus said during the town hall. "I'm here to hold you accountable and make sure these promises turn into real action." The event was broadcast live, drawing millions of viewers. Marcus's presence lent credibility to the airline's commitments, but he made it clear that he and the public would be watching to ensure follow-through. The reunion. Months after the incident, Anna reached out to Marcus again. This time, she invited him to attend a training session she had helped develop. "It would mean a lot to me if you came," Anna wrote in her email. "I want you to see how your experience is shaping change." Curious, Marcus agreed. When he arrived at the training center, he was greeted by Anna, who looked nervous but determined. The session was attended by dozens of flight attendants, all of whom listened intently as Anna recounted her own story of bias and how it had affected Marcus. "Admitting I was wrong wasn't easy," Anna said, her voice steady, "but it was necessary. And I hope that by sharing this, I can help us all do better." Marcus observed the session quietly but felt a sense of closure as he watched Anna take responsibility for her actions and work to educate others. Cultural shift. The incident became a case study in corporate diversity and accountability, cited in universities and leadership programs as an example of how one moment can spark systemic change. The hashtag equity in the skies continued to trend, inspiring passengers to share their own stories and demand better treatment. Marcus's work extended beyond airlines, as he became a sought-after speaker on issues of equity and justice in corporate spaces. Though he remained focused on his business, advocacy had become an integral part of his life. On a bright autumn morning, Marcus boarded a flight for the first time since the incident. This time, the atmosphere felt different. He was greeted warmly by the crew, and as he settled into his seat, he noticed the other passengers around him smiling or nodding in recognition. A young flight attendant approached, handing him a glass of water. "Mr. Carter," she said, "thank you for what you've done. It's made a difference." Marcus smiled, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment. He gazed out the window as the plane ascended, the clouds parting to reveal an endless sky, a reminder that change, like flight, requires persistence, strength, and the courage to rise above, but its impact was just beginning to take flight.